off the cuff.
10, 9, 8, 7.
Welcome back to our webinar today on keeping it confidential, protecting your privileged client communications with encryption. We are now joined by Harlo Holmes, who is a technologist and a trainer who will walk us through all the different ways that you can actually protect your communications. As defense attorneys, you certainly know not to meet your client in the coffee shop to discuss their case. You wouldn't leave your privileged documents in an open folder on a table in the courthouse. But in many ways, if you don't protect your communications, you may be leaving this information out for others to access. So Harlow's going to walk us through some simpler and some less simple ways that you might actually take measures to take to protect your communications. Once she goes through her presentation, we will again be open for questions. And for questions, you can continue to email me at jmusa@nacdl.org. Harlo?
Great. Hi, hello everyone, and thank you very, very much for tuning into this webinar about encryption. Encryption of personal communications primarily, but also what I want to do is I want to walk you through exactly what encryption means and where you encounter it. It actually doesn't always mean, encrypted phone calls or PGP messages. You'd be surprised to learn exactly where encryption happens and where you should look out for it. And learning these tools, learning exactly where encryption happens all across the spectrum of communications is actually going to go very, very far in protecting you and the documents and sources and contacts you hold dear. So first off, by way of introduction, I'm Harlo. I am the digital security trainer at Freedom of the Press Foundation. Now, the previous attorneys who are sitting on the panel did a really, really excellent job of going over the question, why should I even care about encryption? But just to give you a quick refresher, I first want to recall the Snowden revelations of 2013, which really, really opened a lot of people's eyes to how important encryption was, but also how vast and expansive various programs were within, the NSA in order to undermine encryption where it was put in place. So in addition to, all of these programs for collection of metadata and for batch analyzation, which we talk about very, very frequently, I want to spotlight that the PRISM project really, really showed how taking advantage of, certain failures in encryption or certain failures of certain products to maintain encryption actually went a long way to undermining the security as a whole. And it turns out, actually, that even though the documents came out to the public in 2013, this program had gotten started in 2007, and quite frankly, it wasn't even the first of its kind, because a decade earlier, there was the Carnivore program. By the way, full disclosure, this is not the logo of the Carnivore program. I just kind of included that because this is the logo actually of a really, really cool game that came out that actually exposed people to how these mechanisms worked. A little bit of an aside there. So just for all of you sticklers, this is not the logo. That said, the Carnivore project took advantage of the very fact that back in the earlier days of email communications, these were not communications between server was not encrypted to begin with. So that was actually a really, really glaring flaw in the way that this communication tool worked, that agencies were allowed to grab onto and to make work for their purposes. Recently, it was revealed that, or rather a large trove of documents were released, which were essentially wiretaps in a variety of prisons from 37 states. These wiretaps contained phone calls between, inmates at various prisons to their families, to their friends, to their attorneys, especially. And the very, very presence of this dump that came out just shows the fact that wiretapping is 100% possible and made plausible by, just inherent, not necessarily failures, although yes, they can be seen as failures, but just the way that communications infrastructure work. They are usually by nature incredibly transparent, and by having several thousands of wiretapped conversations between inmates and their attorneys and other parties just shows that where possible, lawyers especially have a responsibility to improve the security of their communications so they can maintain client-attorney privilege wherever possible. So I guess the best way to get through that is to talk about the types of encryption, where it happens and where you see it. So here is a diagram that shows the way things kind of were back in, our carnivore days. The orange line on the bottom that connects the mobile phone and the computer, we'll call them clients in this case, represents transport protocols. So these are the routes that take data from one device to another in a conversation through a service provider in the middle, which could be, your ISP, which could be even a service like Facebook or Gmail. We're being elastic with the terminology here, but the point is that data flows from one client to a provider in the middle that has a hand in routing that data to the client on the other end of the conversation. And without any type of encryption whatsoever, it's always been possible that anyone on that orange line can also snoop on the contents of a connection, whether that's the actual audio of a phone call or the text of an email or SMS message or something like that. So this shows the status of things when there's absolutely no encryption implied, and absolutely everyone who might touch the data at any point can actually see the content of the message. People don't do that anymore so much. Over the past, couple of years, there has been a charge to apply transport security, and we're all used to seeing, HTTPS, for instance, the green lock on websites that shows that, or in the address bar that shows that an encrypted connection has been made with the service or the website that you're attempting to watch. Similarly, there is TLS, which is a layer of transport security that protects or encrypts the content of messages as they flow between servers over the internet to provide email. So now you see in this diagram that blue bar has now become, or has gone from orange to blue, meaning it's encrypted. And the three X's represent the fact that the content of the message on either end, as it travels along that blue line, is encrypted from any eyes that might be on that network at that time. However, the service provider in the middle usually does have access to the original content of the message. Of course, metadata usually says where and how to route the data from one client to another, but and service providers rarely take the opportunity to encrypt the actual content of the message. So that service provider in the middle, let's say it's Google or Facebook, they can actually see contents of messages. Once again, these are, over the past couple of years, it's been a huge push to increase the amount of encryption for websites and basic services. You will never, ever actually see anymore a website for a bank, for instance, that is not encrypted. And that's actually a product of years of advocacy and educational initiatives on behalf of public interest organizations such as the EFF. However, there are new frontiers. There's even further where we can go with encryption for websites and things like that. So for instance, you'll see at the top, visiting or reading articles on the New York Times website is, not encrypted by default. However, if you visit the Washington Post, that newspaper does encrypt every article, whether or not you're signed in, regardless. So actually, and why that's important has to do with the fact that now that we don't necessarily have control over, what networks or who is on a particular network that can possibly see the content of what we're looking at, it adds a little bit of like temporal and location-based urgency to, just having encrypted media wherever you go. Another example, the ACLU, of course, also provides HTTPS by default, which is a huge, huge plus for an organization that provides public services. And this might seem like, that I might be, or we might be micromanaging a little bit by insisting that organizations encrypt their websites. However, for an organization like ACLU, where they actually disseminate information in the form of PDFs or other forms that people might need for their legal purposes, you actually do want to know that an organization that is acting in the public interest to disseminate information has your digital protection in mind. So one of the tools that is available that has the possibility to revolutionize how accessible encryption is across the board is a project spearheaded by the EFF, but partnered with many, many organizations called Let's Encrypt. In the past, barriers to offering encryption on web services, for instance, has been kind of stymied by two things. One, the fact that you have to purchase a certificate for just about every site that you want to enable it on. And so for small organizations or small practices or things like that, that cost might be kind of prohibitive. So Let's Encrypt actually does offer a service where you can create fully recognized and fully trusted certificates for free, 100%. Also, it provides a number of tools that actually makes it really, really easy for webmasters or whomever to spin up these certificates and to renew them as they expire, to make sure that they're constantly up to date. So we come back to our model. We've discussed transport security. We've discussed why it's important to have transport security on top of just regular routes of communication. However, there is another way to kick it up a notch, which is to apply end-to-end security on the communications themselves, on the content of the communications themselves. So this is our model once again, and we have easily applied transport security. That was not a barrier. However, when I had mentioned before that the service provider often has the ability to look into the contents of your communication, as in addition to being able to route it to whomever you're talking to, you do want to have control that over that last part of the that last leg of your circuit. You actually want to say that the person in the middle who routes your messages to whomever should not have the privilege of actually looking at the content of the message. And so that's where end-to-end security comes in. Usually that's in the form of apps or other software that provide on either side for every person involved in a communication circuit the same ability to either encrypt or scramble and decrypt, unscramble messages locally on the machine. And that's actually really, really, it's key to maintaining the integrity of a message as it leaves your device destined for someone else's eyes. So for instance, I'll show you what this looks like. A lot of people rarely actually get to see what the encryption stuff looks like before they start using it, so I decided I would provide you a little bit of an opportunity. This is an example of an off-the-record chat using Google Hangouts, where I also employed OTR, which is the real off the record. I'm sorry, I hope that's not confusing. I'll explain it again. Google offers what they call off the record, which is where they tell you that they're not logging conversations between you and people that you enable that with. However, it's not truly like, or their use of the term off the record is not exactly what off the record means from a cryptography point of view. Off the record, OTR is actually, it's a protocol that has been in development for a number of years that provides provides encryption, verification, and perfect forward secrecy in a way that pretty much says that you can be certain that you're talking to the person that you want to be talking to at that time that you're talking, and that's pretty much it. And so what it actually does is your chats literally turn into this gobbledygook that you see there in order to prevent providers such as Google from serving up, the contents of your chat with a person should they be required to do so or compelled to do so by law. And so preventing a provider from having any ability to actually decrypt and provide plain text of a message is the final frontier so far in terms of protecting conversations. So finally, you do want to be aware of the fact that encryption and the tools that we're going to talk about are not panacea. They're not cure-alls. Devices themselves have to be trustworthy. We always recommend that, people are conscientious about doing updates to their operating systems and apps and software as they roll out, as soon as they're aware of them, because security is imperfect all the time, and as you can imagine, news moves very, very quickly. So when exploits are revealed and exploits are discovered, developers work very, very hard to release patches to apply to the software that they already have circulating that you use. So when you receive that notice to upgrade, please do so. Also, antivirus can provide a modicum of protection against a variety of known threats. So while it's definitely not going to cure all of your ills, using a reputable antivirus software can go a long way. And finally, be aware that there is the analog hole. So as you see this gentleman here with his binoculars, nothing can, you can have the best encryption in the world and be very, very good about minding your P's and Q's about password reuse or not reusing passwords, But if someone is literally staring over your shoulder as you type in a decryption passphrase, then all of your effort is for naught. So, keeping in mind that there's other versions of the analog hole, screen captures, accidentally having logging turned on when you definitely did not want to, things like that often do compromise the security of devices. So, as much as we talk about encryption, it's a very important set of tools to learn. However, you do have to pay attention that this is like a mindset, not like a suite of tools that you just install and all of your problems are taken care of. So, if you remember anything from today, please do remember the following. It's not enough to ask whether a service provider intends to circumvent its own encryption, and providers rarely do. There is a great business model in providing encryption, and providers do want to be number one, and keeping your business means providing encryption. However, you have to ask whether a service can circumvent their encryption by nature of their design. And if the answer is yes, then you cannot fully trust the security of that service, because secure communication relies on taking advantage of each of the different types of encryption that we had talked about, and it's never enough to rely on just one. So what are the tools? Of course, there is the infamous GPG, which is GPG is suite of software that comes in various guises depending on your operating system that supports PGP, which is pretty good privacy, a protocol for encrypting messages, which I think aesthetically has like started to really take off and become recognizable. PGP is available on pretty much every single platform. For Mac users, you can find it from GPG tools. For Windows users, you can find it provided by GPG for Win. For Linux users, it's already there. GPG is notoriously painful, especially when people come to it via email. And there's a lot of debate, actually, about how to approach learning and really mastering GPG or PGP, especially when email is involved. It might be a little bit daunting at first. There are a lot of pain points to get through when you're trying to, just get a feel for what it means to properly verify that a message has, really did come from the person who sent it. And so while, as you see here, usually people first encounter PGP via either the Thunderbird mail client with a plugin which is called Enigmail, or they usually come to it via Mac Mail, which integrates pretty readily with, GPG tools. Once again, this one. However, I would say that it's actually not just for email. PGP provides 4 functions. One is to encrypt, obviously, and its mirror, decrypt. The other is to sign something, which is kind of like a notary function, and its inverse, which is to verify. Now, not only does it, operate on email, as we've seen here, but it actually, those functions are available for literally any piece of digital property that you might own on any device you have. So I actually recommend people start out with PGP by just, encrypting and signing gifts to one another and sending them around the office, which is like a perfectly benign way to get your feet wet with this type of thing before you then switch over to something like Enigmail in order to seriously use that within your office. We had talked about earlier about Signal, which used to be called Redphone in the Android version. However, they've unified, their branding, and so now it's just Signal across the board. So Signal for iOS and Android encrypts both text messages or instant messages that go over push notification, and also telephony, so your voice calls. Now, I do want people to know that SMS messages are no longer encrypted by Signal. And so actually now, and this is something that people have to take into account, we're really lacking in an encrypted option for SMS messages, and that's something that you need to take into account, especially if you're communicating with people who don't necessarily have iPhones and who are definitely not hip to the newest news in security. So keeping that in mind, where encryption can and cannot go, will help inform smarter ways of communicating with clients. This is also this highlights one of the big sticking points about end-to-end encryption, which is that actually across the board in all cases, everyone in the conversation has to have the software that can handle the protocol. So just by my using Signal, I'm not going to have an encrypted phone call with, someone on a landline because there does not exist a landline equivalent that can handle, this protocol. Not yet. So keeping in mind that it has to be reciprocal. Everyone has to have the same capabilities in order to enjoy end-to-end encryption. Another thing about encryption is that, or especially from the legal context, is that different offices have different protocols, different practices have different, rules and regulations regarding what can and should be encrypted, to whom, to and how that is used within your work, your day-to-day work. So I fully recommend digging deeply into these tools, especially like the big ones, in order to get a feel for them and in order to like encourage power usage, and then actually having a discussion with the firms that you're in about where to effectively apply these to your communications in office. It depends on the conversation that you have, but hopefully we can give you guys enough tools to have this conversation and have a really impactful conversation. There are, however, things that you can do just on your own by yourself. And these are things that no one should have any qualms with you doing whatsoever. And quite frankly, they're your right to do. So encrypt your disk is kind of the first step. This is free, usually. It comes with your operating system. If you are a Mac user, you have File Vault, which is available via your preferences menu, your system preferences. A little bit of a sticking point with encrypting your disk with File Vault. While by default, Apple will prompt you to encrypt your backups to the cloud or let iCloud have access to this backup process. However, you do not have to do that. You can enable your encryption to take place entirely on your own hard drive that you own physically, and have physical control over with a backup key that Apple does not have to know about, which I actually recommend. For Windows users, for those of you who have Windows Professional versions, there is BitLocker, which is incredibly simple to use and to set up. Another thing that you can and definitely should do is to encrypt your web traffic by using a VPN. Now, a lot of you probably have access to VPNs via work. It's actually incredibly common for a legal practice or any large organization to provide users with a VPN to use, especially when they're traveling or when they're working from home, because securing the telecommuter of today's age is actually a really important a goalpost for the vast majority of IT professionals that you'll meet in your office. So you probably do have use of a VPN. However, if you're not sure of what that is, a VPN is pretty much like a tunnel that encrypts or that takes your web requests, and instead of giving your web request directly to the network or the internet service provider that you're attached to, your web requests go through these encrypted tunnels and exit at certified servers at various points in the world. And so allowing your traffic to exit onto these trusted computers rather than the ones that your ISP is regularly defaults you to using, make sure that you can keep things like your browsing history and naturally, without a doubt, the contents of your browsing safe from prying eyes, because you don't necessarily know who owns the networks that you're using. Now, in terms of, I guess, plausible deniability, different VPNs have different, set of metrics about those things. So some VPNs will retain your web or your browsing history in the case of an audit. And of course, the amount of time that they hold that data varies from provider to provider. That said, there are a number of really excellent privacy-forward VPN providers, such as those provided by the Wrapup collective, but in the form of Bitmask or whatever. And I definitely do recommend checking those out. One other thing to know about VPNs, actually, is that they can be configured not only to use on any particular computer or mobile device, but they can actually be set up at the router point. So imagine setting up a VPN to operate in your home that everyone who comes to your house, everyone in your family, etc., is using the same VPN to tunnel their traffic, and they don't even have to think about how they set it up. You can already set that up for them as on your router, and they can just enjoy it as a guest in your house. Finally, this is the lowest hanging fruit, is two-factor authentication, or 2FA. And this concept actually has been around for a very, very, very long time, but only those who are like really entrenched in bureaucracy for the past couple of decades were really exposed to it. Now it's actually become quite available, and that's another result of a great advocacy and outreach and educational campaign that we've been doing in the public sector. Two-factor authentication is based off of the idea that access to a credential, or a credential, should be based off of the thing that you know, which is usually that passphrase or password, and a thing that you have, which is a physical device. Back in the day, and of course maybe some of you still have these, offices used to provide security tokens that would have like a rotating set of numbers that you would use in addition to your passphrase in order to grant yourself access to an account. Nowadays, actually, you can use a variety of apps. For instance, Google's Authenticator, which is free and available on the Play Store. There's also even open source versions of the same that are also available. But this performs the same function, and the rationale being that the thing that you have is, physical access to the phone in your pocket. So two-factor authentication, usually people think about it in terms of their email, which is fair enough. If you have not yet enabled two-factor authentication on your email account, by all means take the 5 seconds that it does take to do so. That said, there are because two-factor authentication is actually really, really gaining speed and gaining momentum as like a movement, a variety of services down to, even games that you can play offer the same two-factor authentication. So I really, really recommend, this is like a thing you could do with, a couple of minutes. Visit the site, HTTPS, of course, twofactorauth.org, and have a look at the variety of services that currently offer two-factor authentication, and take the moment that it takes to enable them. A lot of people don't necessarily think about how access or a breach of access to one simple account can actually snowball, snowball in a way that you end up having like a large sector of your entire digital identity taken over, because access to one account can often lead to access to another account and to another account and to another account. So if you lock them all, or if you make the attempt to lock them all down, you can prevent that from happening to you as much as possible. People don't necessarily think that, yes, even stuff like Slack provides two-factor authentication. And as our workplaces become more and more dependent on services such as these, you have to think about taking the time to enable them once again. For those of you who would like to really, really increase the physical security of that second factor, that thing that you have, I highly recommend investing in a Yubikey. And actually, with a Yubikey, you may also, not only can you do two-factor authentication, but you can also use this in order to manage your GPG as well, which is a little bit of like, an advanced topic. However, it's done, and it's actually quite painless once you get over that whole, getting familiar with PGP part. So if you'd like to, Yubikeys are actually incredibly inexpensive. For the ones that just handle two-factor authentication, they can run you about $20. However, if you want like a card or a key that's a little bit more capable, feel free to spring for the latest version, the 4, which also can you can enable GPG or PGP on as well. So I'm going to leave it right there. However, there are so many different tips and tricks and tools out there that we would love to talk to you about and take your questions on. And thank you very, very much for having a listen.
All right, thank you, Harlow. So I unsurprisingly already have a whole stack of questions that have come in while you were talking,
Sure.
but I'm still going to take my prerogative and ask one myself. I think when we start thinking about, communications and what's accessible, and you talked about passwords and different things, there's also a number of online storage services like Dropbox where people put documents. And could you talk a little bit about those types of services, when they might be secure, when they're not secure, because obviously for lawyers, they need to think hard about where are they putting their work product and who can access it.
Yes. So there's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind when you're using cloud storage solutions. One is, first off, there are alternatives. People are very, very enthusiastic about 2 major groups. One is OwnCloud, OWNCLOUD. I hope that's how you spell cloud. And the other is Spider Oak. And so these projects actually provide open source and privacy by design, privacy first principles to the same encrypted cloud storage model that, Dropbox and Google Drive already provide. Another thing to think about in terms of the cloud solution things is that you do have all power over what actually goes into those drives and Dropboxes. People have used techniques of encrypting what it is that you place in your cloud storage before it actually gets to the cloud, and that there are solutions, for instance, like Boxcryptor, for instance, that make those things a little bit more intuitive for people who don't want to take the time to, make sure that they're decrypting outside of Dropbox and then working on things and then putting it back. And there's a number of other ways of doing that as well within an office. But just so you guys know that, you can put encrypted information inside of a Dropbox just for ease of use or something like that.
All right, thanks. And I'm going to start with a long list of questions.
Oh, actually, there's another thing that I would want to bring up about that. So those are technological answers to a question, but also you want to think about the political answer and legal answers to the question. So the EFF actually has a really, really great resource called Who's Got Your Back? And I'm sorry, I don't have the link up there, but a quick, use your search engine of choice to find that. Who's Got Your Back rates the various cloud service providers on, how they respond to, one, of course, the metrics on, the types of encryption that they use, access control, so who you share things with and, how flexible that is, but also whether or not, or how they respond to subpoenas and other, legal tools to exfiltrate users' information, and whether or not they publish transparency reports, which is, every corporation's kind of global statement of the past couple of months, what type of requests they responded to, how and when, and vague ideas of where they came from. So it's within everybody's hands to make educated decisions about the type of cloud storage they want to engage in as an office with tools like these. One thing that I would mention about, or some of the gotchas that I've seen about cloud storage over the past couple of years, is that people do not pay as much attention as they should to access control. So, for instance, if IT departments make it very, very difficult for people to share and collaborate on documents in Office using whatever janky software that they have in-house, people will immediately turn to Dropbox. And all of a sudden, so much documentation that was supposed to be kept in-house winds up on people's personal Dropbox accounts at home, at their kid's house, at this computer that they logged into one time at a library, and on their phone that got stolen. So there are, it's within everyone's interest, if you work in an office building, to think about how these choices come to bear on your security of your organization, and make the appropriate choices.
All right, thank you. So the next question we had, Nima earlier had referred to what happens if you're crossing international borders or coming through a U.S. airport, and the ability of the authorities to take your electronic devices, to take them off site, to copy them. And so the question is, if you retain the ability to encrypt and decrypt on your device, are you enabling anyone, like the government, when they pick it up, who gets a hold of it, to then use that encryption, decryption? Or is there a way of keeping that secure? Does that make sense?
Yes, I believe so. So if I understand the question correctly, there's two things. One, it might seem a little bit daunting, but if this is a question that occupies your mind every time you travel, then it's best to invest in, kind of tips and tools to keep sensitive information off of the device that you travel with in the first place. And so before, we say that it's a rainbow world and no one's ever going to take you into a back room and force you to decrypt your painstakingly encrypted computer, the first thing that you would do is, instead, before you get into that situation, is just do not bring that device across border crossings. There are, for instance, we are huge advocates of the Tails operating system because it's that allows you to, have a computer that has pretty much limited capabilities, but have a separate, perhaps even persistent USB stick that contains that is a computer in and of itself that you spin up in order to do work that you need to do while abroad. We also recommend that travelers use, for instance, Chromebooks, but attach them to personas that are not your personal one, but burner Gmail accounts or whatever, because they tend to be more robust when traveling, and a little bit more, or actually vastly more capable to respond to certain malware threats. So it depends on exactly what you fear when you're crossing those borders, but don't be afraid to take the extra step to protect that data. And when in doubt, leave it at home.
Okay, thanks. And I should also just go back and mention the EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and their website is EFF.org, so you can find some of the information that Harlow was referencing. Okay, the next question was from someone who was asking about, if one does not use encrypted email but sends regular email through a VPN, is that email secure? So this person subscribes to a commercial VPN provider. Mm-hmm. And if it's not the same, what are the differences?
So what you would want with encrypted email, when we say encrypted email, what we're talking about is that end-to-end type encrypted email. So we're talking about email where the content of the message itself is scrambled to literally scrambled to such a degree that no matter what happens in transit, that email itself cannot be read. And so that's independent of whether or not whether you send your email from this VPN that you purchase, or whether you send it over a horrible Starbucks internet connection or something like that. Now the second part of encrypted email is discussing whether or not the servers that send your email are actually capable of just using Start TLS, or sending email over an encrypted channel. So that's actually beyond what your VPN can do. It's the sending and receiving servers that can have that capability. And so something that you might have noticed if you're a Gmail user is over the past couple of months, they've kind of silently rolled out little notifications in your emails that tell you whether or not the server that has sent your email had applied encryption or not. And so you probably will only see like the little red unlock warning flag saying that this didn't come encrypted if you're on like some cheesy mailing list or something like that, because those servers have not yet taken responsibility for encrypting their communications.
All right, so the next question was asking about a couple of specific services, which was, could you speak to the security of Box.com versus Dropbox and Viber?
And what?
Viber. And I
Oh.
would also ask that you explain to people what those are.
Yes. Well, actually, I cannot speak to those particular services. But Box.com is another competitor in the cloud storage game. I do not know particularly. I don't have any information. And Viber is an instant messaging client. Yes. And so I don't have any. Actually, I wonder off the top of my head. I don't know about Viber, but it's a little bit old now. But if you want more information, have a look at another really, really excellent EFF tool. Well, this is actually EFF and ProPublica, the public interest org. They created a couple years back a secure messaging checklist, and that actually took a look at the really, really large number of like the top instant messaging players and evaluated them on about 7 questions having to do with these particular questions. Are messages encrypted in transit? Are messages end-to-end encrypted? Has the security implementation been vetted by like professionals in the sphere? And a couple of other questions about that. So if Viber is on there, you might that will definitely have answers to your question. I haven't heard any news about Viber in like a couple of years. You know how apps are. Some of them like gain popularity and then they drop off the face of the earth because nobody's using them and somebody's using something else. So.
All right, so the next question relates back to PGP encryption, which is, does encryption like PGP also encrypt email attachments, the documents or whatever else someone puts on the email?
Yes, although it depends on. It should. Every email implementation of PGP should encrypt your messages. And different ways of using PGP on top of email will give you like choice to a varying degree. So for instance, the Thunderbird and Enigmail thing, which is what I think like maybe about almost the majority of PGP users do at this point, that does give you the option to encrypt your attachments along with your with the content of your message, all in PGP, or to encrypt using like S-MIME, which is a different type of encryption, and then apply PGP to the message. And so having the choice of it kind of spelled out for you could be a relief to you. Especially if you want to mess with the configurations. However, be aware that there are certain implementations of email that do not do that. So for instance, Mailvelope, contrary to popular belief, does not encrypt your attachments. So if you're not wary, I can imagine people getting themselves into situations where they're sending a message with an attachment and think because the message itself is encrypted that the attachment will be as well, but in fact that's not the case. So good of you to ask that question if ever you are in doubt.
All right, the next question relates to the Signal app, which is, why is Signal app recommended if you have to give the app provider access to all of your contacts? If Signal is no longer encrypting messaging, what value does it have?
Well, access to contacts is not the same as the encryption of the messages. Although I definitely do understand, I definitely do understand and I commiserate as well, that kind of push back against our privacy with a lot of apps when they take our contact lists, and because that builds up like a social graph, that builds up a network, and that builds up a lot of metadata. However, while I agree that I personally hate it when, I join an app and it says like, hey, guess what? Your friend joined Signal, or your friend joined Telegram, or whatever. I really, really hate that. And that does not need to be part of the experience, but access to contact lists in these apps are applied in order to better route and better connect you with with other users of this app. So another thing about that question that I do want to make clear is that there's a difference between, the encryption of the content of the message and the metadata that sometimes, by just very nature of it being a communications app, needs to exist. That said, there are a couple of excellent projects that are also taking the care to encrypt certain metadata. So be on the lookout for that as well.
Okay, and I'm just going to remind people, if you have questions, you can email me at jmusa@nacdl.org. So the next question is about Gmail, which is how would I enable 2FA in Gmail?
Oh, okay. So if they get, I wish they'd give me, do I have access to control the computer? Because, all right, never mind, I won't. That said, all right, listen to my voice. When you go to https://twofactorauth.org, there's a search bar at the top. And actually, where's the... Okay, so there's the search bar at the top. Feel free to search for Gmail. When you see the service that you want to enable two-factor auth on, there is that second column which takes you directly to the site on the documentation, on that particular service that has a documentation for how to enable two-factor authentication. Google's and the Google Sphere's two-factor auth process is actually pretty streamlined. It takes a lot of clicking through stuff, which is okay, and it might be a little bit boring and tedious, but it will eventually get you there. There is the main security panel has like pretty much 4 tabs that really explicitly show how to, when your passwords have been last changed, if you've enabled two-factor authentication, and other parameters, whether or not you have a Yubikey, and then it actually like digs down really, really deeply in order to help you manage that to the most minute detail. And finally, if you're, and this is just kind of good digital hygiene, Google offers the security check, which is a really, really handy wizard of taking you through all of that. So it'll ask you the questions that you need to be asked in order to finally get to enabling your two-factor authentication.
Great. Okay, so the next question is about passwords and your thoughts on using password managers such as 1Password or LastPass, whether using password managers creates a security risk despite the encryption of the passwords in the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so my fundamental belief is that any service that holds a key of yours, a private key of yours, on their servers is ultimately a liability. We have seen publicly that LastPass security had been breached in the past, and of course, they vault to fix it, and good for them. I mean, that's really, really responsive of them. However, that said, any service that holds a private key of yours will ultimately be a point of failure. And so while I do realize that like LastPass is incredibly user-friendly, and it's actually kind of the creme de la creme in terms of like, that flagship service, but if you don't have to, there are alternatives that do not require you to put your key and to put your master passphrase and stuff like that up into the cloud where it's held by a third party. So for instance, KeePass or KeePassX provides the same, and they're also compatible because they create their password databases in the same way. They're compatible with one another. So if you wanted to migrate to LastPass at some point, you could. But these actually have the advantage of making sure that like the passphrase manager it stays on your machine or on the place that you actually explicitly say, and it doesn't ever have to touch the internet. That said, password managers are amazing. I think that they're spectacular. The ones that stay off of the internet are the best. So, yeah.
All right, thanks. So the next question is about another communications app, which is communicating by WhatsApp encrypted and protected from service providers? And if so, why is this method not recommended as others?
Well, I don't really know. Okay, so WhatsApp, their peer-to-peer, their person-to-person messaging is encrypted. There are problems, and this is actually kind of across the board, really, with group chats. So group chats usually have to either have to be explicitly enabled or don't work as people think that they do. And so just a little bit of prevention goes a long way, and research into what your app can and cannot provide goes a long way before getting yourself into possible trouble. That said, though, WhatsApp or not only WhatsApp, but also because WhatsApp actually is one implementation of a protocol that you also can find in Signal and in a variety of other projects that have been cropping up, some open source, some closed, that all use this communications protocol. And there are challenges to multi-person chat, but they are being worked out in that protocol.
Okay. And so you've been with us for an hour now, so I'm just going to take an opportunity to ask you a wrap-up question.
Sure.
So if you're someone like me who is not maybe that tech savvy and is now sitting here with all these things swimming in my head, there's YubiKeys and PGPs and GPGs, and the GPG relates to the PGP, and so now,
Sorry, I said
what
that.
do we do with all this information? Is there the easy 1, 2, 3 where start with level A, if you feel confident go to level B, and if you're the tech rock star you can go straight to C? Is there the website that sort of holds your hand while you do this? How does someone sort of jump in and get their start?
Yes. Okay. So it definitely depends on how much time you have and how much effort you want to put into it. But if you want to get started with PGP, for instance, the Free Software Foundation has a really, really great guide to getting set up with PGP. They actually even have a robot named Edward, and you email him just to test if your PGP is properly set up, and then it emails you back, and then you go through these processes to get set up. Once again, EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, has the Security Self-Defense website, which is a vast trove of really, really great up-to-date information. Some of it might be a little bit dense, but at least it's all in one place, and feel free to take as much time as you want picking through it and looking at your options. A group called Tactical Tech has a really, really fabulous resource called Security in a Box, and that is geared more towards actually I find that very, very helpful for Windows users, although some of that information is a bit out of date, but it's still a really, really fabulous resource for just getting started and understanding exactly this more security focused mindset in a way that I don't find too daunting.
Thank you so much, Harlow. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our presenters, Jack Gillum from the AP, Nima Guliani from the ACLU, and Harlo Holmes from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. For any of you who want to go back and review any of this webinar was recorded and it will go up on the NACDL website. Thank you for joining us today.